A loyal dog refuses to leave an unmarked grave. What could he be guarding? When the police finally open it, they uncover a shocking truth tied to a dangerous man and a town's darkest secrets. What was the dog protecting? And why is the entire town terrified? Stick around to uncover this incredible journey. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. The wind whispered through the dense rows of towering oaks, carrying with it the faint scent of damp earth. Rufus sat unmoving by the grave, his amber eyes fixed on the unmarked headstone, as though it held the secrets of 1,000 lifetimes. His coat, streaked with grey along his muzzle, glistened in the moonlight as if imbued with a light of its own. To any passerby, he might have looked like an ordinary stray, but there was nothing ordinary about Rufus. Margaret Fenton, known simply as Maggie, tightened her scarf as she approached the cemetery gates. Retirement hadn't dulled her curiosity, and the cemetery, with its eerie reputation and tangled history, had become a quiet refuge for her daily walks. Tonight, however, was different. A sense of unease settled in her chest as she spotted Rufus in his usual place by the grave. For weeks now, she had observed him, his unwavering vigil stirring something deep within her. A question she couldn't ignore. "Still here, aren't you?" Maggie whispered under her breath as she approached, her voice trembling slightly, not from fear, but an inexplicable sadness. Rufus didn't flinch. His gaze, steady and unyielding, seemed to penetrate the very soil beneath his paws. The grave had no name, no inscription, only an old rusted lantern resting beside it, its glass cracked and fogged. Maggie had asked Edward Monroe, the cemetery caretaker, about the grave weeks ago. His answer had been unsettling. "That one," he'd said, scratching his head. "It's been there for years. No one ever comes to visit it. But that dog, he showed up one day and hasn't left since." The words had stuck with her, lingering in her thoughts like an unfinished sentence. Tonight, as the wind howled and the branches creaked overhead, Maggie felt compelled to do what she hadn't dared before: step closer. "Rufus," she called softly, her voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. She didn't know his name, of course, but it felt wrong to think of him as just a dog. He turned his head slightly, acknowledging her presence, but making no move to leave his post. She stepped forward cautiously, her boots crunching on the gravel path. Rufus's ears perked, and a low growl rumbled in his throat. Maggie froze. It wasn't a threat, it was a warning. Her heart pounded as she stood there, caught in a silent standoff with the enigmatic guardian of the grave. All right," she murmured, raising her hands in a gesture of peace. She took a step back, and the growling ceased. Rufus lowered his head, resting it on his paws as if to say, "This far, no further." The encounter left Maggie shaken. As she walked home, the image of Rufus by the grave burned in her mind. There was something profoundly haunting about his devotion, something that felt almost human. She couldn't shake the feeling that the dog was guarding more than just a plot of earth. The following morning, Maggie returned to the cemetery, unable to resist the pull of her curiosity. Edward was tending to a nearby plot, his weathered hands deftly pulling weeds and trimming the overgrown grass. She approached him cautiously. "Edward," she began, "that dog by the grave, do you know anything about why he's there?" Edward straightened, his eyes narrowing as he glanced toward Rufus in the distance. "I told you, he just showed up one day. Been here ever since. It's strange though." "What's strange?" He hesitated, his hands gripping the handle of his spade tightly. "I've worked this cemetery for over 30 years, Miss Fenton. Seen all kinds of things. But that grave, it's different. The soil around it never seems to settle, like it's restless. And then there's the dog. It's almost like he's protecting it from something, or someone." Maggie felt a chill run down her spine. "Have you ever looked inside?" Edward shook his head firmly. "It's not my place to disturb the dead." That night, unable to sleep, Maggie found herself staring out her window toward the cemetery in the distance. The image of Rufus, his unwavering gaze fixed on the grave, replayed in her mind. What was he guarding? Why did he growl at anyone who came near? And why did the grave remain unmarked, as if someone had deliberately erased its identity? The questions gnawed at her, and before she knew it, she was slipping on her coat and boots, determined to find answers. The cemetery was silent when she arrived, the moon casting long shadows across the headstones. Rufus was there, as always, his figure illuminated by the faint glow of the old lantern. Maggie approached slowly, careful not to startle him. "What is it, boy?" she whispered. "What are you trying to protect?" As if in response, Rufus stood and turned toward her, his eyes locking onto hers. There was something in his gaze, something almost pleading. Maggie's breath caught in her throat as she realized he wasn't warning her away. He was asking for her help. She knelt, her heart pounding. Rufus stepped aside slightly, allowing her a closer look at the grave. Her hands trembled as she reached out, brushing away the leaves and dirt that had gathered on the surface. Her fingers caught on something, a piece of frayed cloth buried just beneath the soil. She pulled it free, revealing a fragment of what appeared to be a jacket, its fabric worn and tattered. A name was stitched into the lining. T. Grayson. Maggie's heart raced as she stared at the name. Who was T. Grayson, and why was Rufus so determined to protect this grave? She glanced up at the dog, who now stood silently, his gaze heavy with something she could only describe as expectation. "This isn't just a grave," she murmured. "It's a story, and you're the only one who knows it." The words hung in the air, heavy with a truth she couldn't yet grasp. Rufus sat back down, his vigil unbroken. Maggie knew in that moment that she couldn't turn away. The mystery of the grave and the dog who guarded it was only just beginning to unfold. The morning air carried a chill as Maggie returned to the cemetery, her mind restless from the discovery of the jacket fragment. The name T. Grayson lingered like an unsolved equation, a puzzle piece that refused to fit. She didn't know who he was or what his connection to the grave might be, but she was certain of one thing. Rufus was guarding more than just earth and stone. Edward was by the caretaker's shed when she arrived, sipping coffee from a dented thermos. His usual stoic demeanour softened when he saw Maggie approach, the jacket fragment tucked neatly into a plastic bag she held. "Edward," she said, her voice steady but urgent. "I found this last night by the grave. Do you recognise the name T. Grayson?" Edward set down his thermos, his brow furrowing. "Grayson? Can't say it rings a bell. Could be someone who passed through town years ago, or someone who never left," Maggie replied, her gaze shifting toward the grave, where Rufus sat, as vigilant as ever. Edward scratched his chin, his expression clouded with thought. "I'll be honest, Miss Fenton, there's something about that grave that doesn't sit right with me. Back when I started working here, it was just another plot. But about 12 years ago, some strangers came into town, well-dressed, serious-looking folk. They paid for a burial, but they didn't leave a name, and they didn't stick around for a service. Just handed me the payment and told me to dig." "Didn't you think that was strange?" Maggie asked, her voice rising slightly. "Of course I did," Edward admitted. "But it's not my job to ask questions. People bury their dead for all sorts of reasons. Some just want to leave the past behind." Maggie's mind raced. 12 years ago. Could that have been when T. Grayson was buried? And if so, why would someone go to such lengths to erase his identity? That evening, Maggie went to the town library, a quaint brick building nestled between the post office and the diner. The archives were dusty and disorganised, but Maggie's determination outweighed the inconvenience. Hours passed as she combed through old newspapers and records, her eyes scanning for any mention of the name Grayson. Finally, she found it. A headline from 12 years ago: "Local journalist Thomas Grayson missing, feared dead." Her breath caught as she read the article. Thomas Grayson had been an investigative reporter known for exposing corruption in small towns across the state. His work had earned him both admiration and enemies. The article detailed his sudden disappearance, while investigating allegations of fraud involving Briarwood's former mayor, Arthur Crowley. The last line of the piece sent a chill down her spine. "Authorities believe foul play may be involved, but no evidence has been found. Maggie leaned back in her chair, the weight of the revelation sinking in. Thomas Grayson, a journalist who vanished under mysterious circumstances. Could this be the same T. Grayson buried in the unmarked grave? And if so, what was Rufus's connection to him? The library closed before Maggie could finish her search, but her curiosity only grew stronger. She left with a notebook full of scribbled notes and a resolve to uncover the truth. The next day, Maggie found herself at the sheriff's office. Clara Delaney was sitting behind her desk, her no-nonsense demeanour matched by the precise way she organised her paperwork. Maggie had known Clara for years, but their relationship had always been distant. Today, however, Maggie needed her help. "Clara," Maggie began, holding up the plastic bag with the jacket fragment. "I think this grave is connected to Thomas Grayson's disappearance." Clara raised an eyebrow, leaning back in her chair. "Thomas Grayson? That's a name I haven't heard in a long time. What makes you think there's a connection?" Maggie explained everything. The grave, Rufus's behaviour, the fragment of the jacket, and the mysterious burial 12 years ago. Clara listened intently, her expression growing darker with each detail. When Maggie finished, Clara sighed. "I remember the Grayson case. It was big news back then, but it went cold fast. No body, no evidence, just a lot of questions. Questions that might finally have answers," Maggie said, her voice filled with urgency. "But I need your help to dig deeper." Clara hesitated, her fingers drumming against the desk. "Maggie, you're asking me to reopen a case that's been closed for over a decade. You know how people in this town are. They don't like stirring up the past." "But what if the past isn't finished with us?" Maggie countered, her eyes locking with Clara's. "That dog is sitting by that grave for a reason. If we don't figure out why, we're turning our backs on the truth." Clara sighed again, this time with resignation. "All right, I'll look into it. But don't go getting yourself into trouble, Maggie. If Grayson's disappearance is connected to the corruption he was investigating, you might not like what you find." That night, Maggie returned to the cemetery. Rufus greeted her with a low wag of his tail, his demeanour softer than before. She knelt beside him, her hand resting gently on his fur. "You were his, weren't you?" she whispered. "Thomas Grayson, you were his dog." Rufus's eyes met hers, and for a moment she felt as though he understood every word. Her heart ached at the thought of the loyalty this dog had shown, waiting by a grave for a man who had likely met a violent end. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the faint sound of voices. Maggie turned, her pulse quickening. The cemetery was empty, but the feeling of being watched lingered. She shook her head, chalking it up to nerves, but the unease stayed with her as she left. The following morning, Clara called. "Maggie, we need to talk," she said, her tone grim. "I went through some old records last night. There's something you need to see." They met at the sheriff's office, where Clara handed Maggie a file. Inside were documents from the original investigation into Thomas Grayson's disappearance. One report stood out, a witness statement from a man named Jonathan Redford, who claimed to have seen Grayson arguing with someone near the river the night he vanished. "Who's Jonathan Redford?" Maggie asked. "A businessman," Clara replied. "He owns half the real estate in town now, but back then he was just starting out. If he was involved in Grayson's disappearance, he's been hiding it well." Maggie felt a spark of hope. This was the first solid lead in a case that had been buried for years, but as she studied the file, a sense of dread crept over her. The deeper they dug, the more dangerous this would become. Clara seemed to sense Maggie's unease. "We'll take this one step at a time," she said. "But Maggie, if Redford had something to do with Grayson's death, we're not just dealing with a missing person case, we're dealing with a cover-up." Maggie nodded, her resolve hardening. "Then we'll uncover it. For Thomas, and for Rufus." As she left the office, Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that the truth was closer than ever, but so was the danger. Rufus's unwavering presence at the grave now felt like a beacon, not just of loyalty, but of warning. Whatever lay buried in Briarwood's past was about to surface, and Maggie was determined to see it through. The morning light filtered through the dense canopy of oaks surrounding Evergreen Ridge Cemetery, casting fractured shadows across the gravestones. Maggie stood at the edge of the unmarked grave, her thoughts a jumble of curiosity and dread. The name Thomas Grayson was now etched firmly into her mind, and with it came the weight of responsibility. She couldn't let this rest, not when the answers felt so close. Rufus sat beside her, his amber eyes scanning the surroundings as though guarding against unseen threats. There was a stillness in his posture, but his ears twitched, catching every sound. It was as if he understood the significance of what was about to unfold. The faint crunch of gravel signaled Clara's arrival. The sheriff approached with measured steps, carrying a small box in one hand. "Maggie," she greeted, her voice low. "I brought you something." Maggie's gaze shifted to the box. Inside were the files Clara had managed to dig up. A collection of witness statements, police reports, and a faded photograph of Thomas Grayson. He was a striking figure, with sharp features and a confident smile that hinted at both intelligence and defiance. "This was all we could find from the initial investigation," Clara said, handing Maggie the box. "There's not much, but maybe it will give us a lead." Maggie carefully sifted through the contents. Most of it was routine. Reports of Thomas's last known whereabouts, vague leads that had gone cold, and a timeline that abruptly ended the night he disappeared. But it was the photograph that held her attention. In it, Thomas stood in front of what appeared to be a boathouse, the water shimmering behind him. Maggie's heart quickened. "Do you recognize this place?" she asked Clara, holding up the photo. Clara frowned, leaning closer. "That's Briarwood Lake. The boathouse has been abandoned for years. Why?" Maggie's instincts flared. "I think we need to take a look. If this was taken shortly before his disappearance, there might be something there." Clara hesitated, glancing toward Rufus, who had perked up as if understanding their conversation. "All right," she said finally, "but we need to be careful. If anyone tried to cover this up, they won't take kindly to us poking around." They arrived at the lake just before noon. The boathouse stood in a secluded corner, its wooden exterior weathered and overgrown with ivy. The air smelled of damp wood and algae, and the water lapped gently against the shoreline. Rufus led the way, his nose to the ground, his movements deliberate and purposeful. Inside, the boathouse was dim, with sunlight filtering through broken slats in the walls. Maggie's breath caught as she noticed the faint outlines of muddy footprints leading toward a corner. Rufus growled softly, his body tense. "Here," Maggie whispered, pointing to a stack of crates. Together, she and Clara began to move them aside, revealing a trapdoor hidden beneath. Maggie's hands trembled as she lifted it, revealing a small, dark compartment below. Clara shone her flashlight inside, illuminating a dusty space filled with old papers, a rusted typewriter, and a box labelled with the initials TG. Maggie's heart raced as she reached for the box, her fingers brushing against its cold metal surface. When she opened it, the contents took her breath away. Inside were photographs, receipts, and handwritten notes, all documenting a web of corruption that ran deep within Briarwood's government. One photograph in particular made Maggie's blood run cold. It showed Thomas Grayson shaking hands with Arthur Crowley, the former mayor. Both men appeared tense, their expressions betraying the cordiality of the gesture. "This is it," Maggie murmured, her voice trembling. "This is what he was working on." Clara crouched beside her, flipping through the notes. Fraud, embezzlement, illegal land deals. Thomas must have uncovered all of this before he disappeared. "But why would he hide it here?" Maggie asked. "Maybe he knew he was being watched," Clara suggested. "If he felt his life was in danger, he might have hidden the evidence to protect it." Rufus barked sharply, drawing their attention. He stood at the doorway, his body rigid, his ears pinned back. Clara rose quickly, one hand on her holstered weapon. "We're not alone," she said. Maggie's pulse quickened as she heard the faint crunch of footsteps outside. She clutched the box tightly, her mind racing. Moments later, a shadow crossed the doorway, and a man stepped inside. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a face that radiated authority and unease. "Jonathan Redford," Clara said, her voice steady. "What brings you here?" Jonathan's gaze flickered to the box in Maggie's hands, and his jaw tightened. I could ask you the same thing, he replied. This is private property. Since when do you care about an abandoned boathouse? Clara shot back. Jonathan's lips curled into a tight smile. Let's just say I have a vested interest in what's hidden here. Maggie stepped forward, her grip on the box firm. You knew Thomas Grayson, didn't you? You were the last person to see him alive. Jonathan's eyes narrowed. I don't know what you're talking about. Then why are you here? Maggie demanded. Why are you so interested in this place? Before Jonathan could respond, Rufus growled, his stance aggressive. Jonathan took a step back, his confidence wavering. Clara seized the moment. Let's cut the games, Redford, she said. What do you know about Grayson's disappearance? Jonathan hesitated, his eyes darting between Maggie, Clara, and the dog. Finally, he sighed. All right, fine. I knew Grayson. He came to me with some wild accusations about the mayor. Said he had proof that Crowley was stealing from the town. I told him to drop it, that it wasn't worth the trouble. And then what? Maggie pressed. And then he disappeared, Jonathan said, his voice flat. I didn't have anything to do with it, if that's what you're thinking. But if he left something behind, well, let's just say there are people who wouldn't want it found. Maggie's stomach churned. What kind of people? Jonathan didn't answer. Instead, he turned and walked out, leaving them with more questions than answers. Rufus barked after him, but Maggie placed a calming hand on his back. Clara turned to Maggie, her expression grim. We need to move fast. If Redford's involved, this is bigger than we thought. They gathered the evidence and left the boathouse, their minds racing with possibilities. As they drove back to Briarwood, Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. Every car that passed seemed suspicious, every shadow a potential threat. When they arrived at Maggie's house, Clara insisted on staying the night. If Redford or anyone else tries to stop us, they'll have to go through me first, she said. Maggie nodded, grateful for the support, but unable to shake the fear that had settled in her chest. She looked down at Rufus, who lay at her feet, his eyes watchful. We're going to figure this out, she whispered. We're going to find out what happened to him. Rufus wagged his tail slightly, his gaze steady. Maggie felt a flicker of hope. Together they had uncovered a piece of the puzzle, but the full picture remained elusive and the danger was far from over. The next morning brought an eerie calm, the kind that precedes a storm. Maggie sat at her kitchen table, the contents of the box spread before her. The papers told a story of betrayal, greed, and desperation, yet there were still too many gaps. Each document felt like a whisper of a secret, a truth that refused to be fully revealed. Rufus lay at her feet, his watchful eyes tracking her every move. Clara entered the kitchen, her face shadowed with concern. She set a mug of coffee in front of Maggie before sitting down. I made some calls last night, Clara began. Arthur Crowley left Briarwood 5 years ago. No one knows where he is now, but if Thomas Grayson's notes are accurate, Crowley wasn't working alone. Maggie frowned, flipping through a stack of receipts from the box. There are names here, initials mostly, but a few full names. Do any of them mean anything to you? Clara took the papers, her brow furrowing as she scanned them. These are payments, large ones. Look at the dates. They line up with major construction projects in town. The community centre, the new park, they're all here. You think the money was laundered through public works projects? Maggie asked. Clara nodded grimly. If Grayson figured that out, it would have been enough to put Crowley and half the town's leadership behind bars. Maggie's hands trembled slightly as she picked up a photograph from the pile. It showed Thomas sitting at a table in what appeared to be a dimly lit bar, papers spread out before him. Standing over him was a man Maggie didn't recognize, his face partially obscured by shadows, but his posture was tense, almost threatening. Do you know who this is? She asked, holding up the photograph. Clara shook her head. No, but I can ask around. If this man was involved, someone might remember him. Before Maggie could respond, Rufus stood abruptly, his ears perked and his gaze fixed on the window. A low growl rumbled in his throat, sending a chill down Maggie's spine. Clara followed his gaze, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. He's been on edge since we left the boathouse. Maggie said quietly. It's like he knows something's coming. Clara stood, her hand instinctively resting on her holstered weapon. Stay here, she instructed, moving toward the door. Maggie wanted to argue, but knew better than to disobey. Rufus followed Clara, his movements deliberate and cautious. Minutes passed in tense silence before Clara returned, her face set in a grim expression. There's a car parked down the street. I've seen it twice now. It doesn't belong to anyone around here. Maggie's pulse quickened. You think they're watching us? I don't think it's a coincidence, Clara replied. We need to be careful. The day passed in a haze of unease. Maggie and Clara spent hours poring over the documents, piecing together a timeline of events leading up to Thomas's disappearance. Each new discovery painted a clearer picture of the corruption in Briarwood, but it also raised more questions. By evening, the tension had reached a boiling point. Clara insisted they move the evidence to a safer location, fearing that whoever was watching might try to intervene. Maggie reluctantly agreed, though the thought of leaving Rufus behind filled her with unease. He had been her constant companion through this ordeal, a silent guardian who seemed to understand the stakes better than anyone. As they prepared to leave, Rufus began barking furiously, his gaze fixed on the front door. Clara moved quickly, her weapon drawn, while Maggie clutched the box tightly to her chest. Moments later, the door burst open, and a man stepped inside, a man Maggie recognized from the photograph. He raised his hands immediately, his face pale and drawn. "Don't shoot," he said, his voice trembling. "I'm not here to hurt you." Clara didn't lower her weapon. "Who are you, and what do you want?" "My name is Victor Hale," the man said. "I worked with Thomas Grayson." Maggie's grip on the box tightened. "Worked with him how?" Victor hesitated, his gaze darting between Maggie and Clara. "I was his source. I gave him the documents you're holding." Clara narrowed her eyes. "If that's true, why didn't you come forward when he disappeared?" Victor's shoulders sagged, and he ran a hand through his dishevelled hair. "Because I was scared. Thomas was getting too close to something dangerous, and I knew it would get him killed. I tried to warn him, but he wouldn't listen." "And now?" Maggie asked, her voice sharp. "Why are you here now?" "Because I saw you at the boathouse," Victor admitted. "I knew if you found that box, you'd be in danger too. The people Thomas was investigating, they don't play games. If they think you have proof, they'll do whatever it takes to silence you." Clara lowered her weapon slightly, but didn't holster it. "What do you know about Crowley?" Victor's expression darkened. "Crowley was the face of it, but he wasn't the mastermind. There's someone else, someone higher up. I don't know his name, but I've seen him. He was the one who ordered Thomas to be silenced." Maggie felt a wave of nausea. "And you didn't do anything to stop it?" Victor's eyes flashed with anger. "You think I didn't try? I begged Thomas to walk away, but he wouldn't. He said people deserve to know the truth, no matter the cost." Silence filled the room as Victor's words sank in. Maggie glanced at Rufus, who sat quietly now, his gaze steady and unwavering. "What happened the night he disappeared?" she asked. Victor's voice softened. "Thomas called me. He said he had everything he needed to blow the case wide open. He asked me to meet him at the river, but when I got there, he was gone. The only thing I found was his jacket, torn and blood-stained." Maggie's heart ached at the thought. "And you didn't go to the police?" "I was too scared," Victor admitted. "I thought if I stayed quiet, they'd leave me alone, but I was wrong. They've been watching me ever since." Clara stepped forward, her expression unreadable. "If what you're saying is true, then you're coming with us. We're going to the station." Victor didn't argue. As they prepared to leave, Rufus stood and moved to Maggie's side, his presence a comfort amidst the chaos. Maggie glanced at Clara, her resolve hardening. "We're not stopping," she said quietly. "No matter how dangerous it gets, we owe it to Thomas and to Rufus." Clara nodded. "Then let's finish this." As they stepped outside, the night air felt heavy, charged with the weight of what was to come. Maggie held the box tightly, her thoughts racing. The secrets buried in Briarwood were beginning to surface, But the truth was far from complete, and with every step they took, the danger grew closer, looming like a shadow over them all. The first rays of sunlight crept over Briarwood, but the usual calm of the small town had been shattered. By mid-morning, whispers of Maggie and Clara's discovery had reached the diner, the hardware store, and the church. A grave in Evergreen Ridge Cemetery, guarded by a dog with an almost supernatural loyalty, held secrets that could tear the town apart. Maggie stood at her window, watching as neighbours gathered in hushed groups on the street below. Their faces were a mix of curiosity and unease, as though sensing that something long buried was clawing its way to the surface. Rufus sat by her side, his steady gaze fixed on the people outside, his body tense. Clara arrived an hour later, her uniform crisp but her expression grim. "It's spreading," she said, stepping into the kitchen where Maggie had laid out the files and photographs. "People are talking about Crowley again, about the construction projects. They're starting to ask questions." "They should," Maggie replied, her voice firm. "This town has been living under a veil for too long. It's time they see the truth." Clara sat down, running a hand through her hair. "It's not that simple. Crowley might be gone, but the people who backed him, they're still here. Business owners, council members, even the church. If we don't handle this carefully, they'll bury this story before it ever sees the light of day." Maggie leaned forward, her fingers tracing the edge of a photograph of Thomas Grayson. "We can't let them. He died for this, Clara. We owe it to him and to Rufus to make sure his sacrifice wasn't in vain." Rufus let out a low growl, his ears twitching toward the door. Clara frowned, her hand instinctively moving to her holstered weapon. Moments later, there was a knock. Maggie's heart skipped as she opened the door to find a group of townspeople standing on her porch. The man at the front was Samuel Briggs, the owner of the local hardware store and one of the most vocal supporters of Arthur Crowley during his tenure as mayor. "Miss Fenton," he said, his voice polite but edged with suspicion, "we've been hearing some troubling things about that grave you've been poking around." Maggie held her ground. "And what exactly have you been hearing, Mr. Briggs?" "That you're digging up ghosts that don't need disturbing," he replied, his gaze shifting briefly to Rufus. "This town has its problems, but we've moved on from the Crowley years. Why dredge up the past now?" "Because the past isn't gone," Maggie shot back. "It's still here, hiding in plain sight. People like Crowley used this town for their own gain, and people like Thomas Grayson paid the price for trying to stop them." Samuel's face darkened. "Be careful, Miss Fenton. Not everyone in Briarwood wants to hear about skeletons in the closet." Before Maggie could respond, Clara stepped forward, her tone sharp. "That sounded an awful lot like a threat, Briggs. You've got a problem with this investigation. You bring it to me. Otherwise, stay out of the way." The group lingered for a moment before dispersing, their muttered conversations trailing off as they walked away. Maggie closed the door, her hands trembling slightly. "They're scared," she said softly. "They know we're onto something." "Fear makes people dangerous," Clara replied. "We need to move fast." By that afternoon, the town was buzzing. Rumours of Thomas Grayson's disappearance and the evidence uncovered in the boathouse had reached nearly every household. Some saw it as a chance to finally expose the corruption that had plagued Briarwood, while others viewed it as a threat to the town's fragile stability. At the community centre, a heated meeting was underway. Dozens of residents had gathered, their voices rising in anger and frustration. Maggie and Clara stood at the back, watching as Samuel Briggs took the floor. "This is madness," Samuel shouted. "What good will come from tearing open old wounds? Crowley is gone, and stirring up his mess will only bring trouble to our town." A younger man in the crowd, Ethan Marlowe, stood up, his face flushed with anger. "Maybe you're afraid because you were part of that mess, Briggs. You supported Crowley, didn't you? How much of his dirty money ended up in your pocket?" The room erupted into chaos, with shouts and accusations flying in every direction. Maggie stepped forward, her voice cutting through the noise like a knife. "Enough!" The crowd quieted, all eyes turning to her. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "This isn't about blaming each other. It's about uncovering the truth. Thomas Grayson gave his life. trying to expose what was happening in this town. Are we really going to let his sacrifice mean nothing? There was a murmur of agreement, though some faces remained skeptical. Samuel crossed his arms, his expression hard. And what if that truth destroys us, Miss Fenton? What if it tears this town apart? Then maybe it's time it was torn apart, Maggie replied, her voice resolute. Because the foundation it was built on is rotten. The meeting ended with no clear resolution, but the lines had been drawn. Maggie could feel the tension in the air as she and Clara walked back to the car. Rufus trotted beside them, his steps light but purposeful. We're making enemies, Clara said quietly. Powerful ones. I know, Maggie replied. But we're also finding allies. People like Ethan. They want the truth, just like we do. That night, Maggie couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, watching the empty street below. Rufus lay at her feet, his presence a comfort in the oppressive silence. Her thoughts were a whirlwind of possibilities and fears. The documents in the box were damning, but they weren't enough. She needed more, something definitive, something that couldn't be dismissed or buried. The answer came in the early hours of the morning, just as the first light began to seep through the curtains. Maggie remembered the journal. It was mentioned in one of Thomas's notes, a record he kept of his investigation. If she could find it, it might hold the key to everything. She woke Clara, who groggily agreed to accompany her to the cemetery. The morning air was crisp and still as they arrived at Evergreen Ridge. Rufus led them straight to the grave, his movements deliberate. Maggie knelt, her hands trembling as she began to dig. It didn't take long to find it. Buried just beneath the surface was a small, weathered book wrapped in oilcloth. Maggie's heart pounded as she unwrapped it, revealing the worn leather cover. She opened it carefully, the pages brittle with age, but the words inside still legible. The journal was a treasure trove of information. It detailed Thomas's investigation, his meetings with sources, and the threats he received as he got closer to the truth. It also named names, Arthur Crowley, Samuel Briggs, and others Maggie hadn't expected. But it was the final entry that shook her to her core. In it, Thomas described a meeting he had arranged at the boathouse. He wrote of his fear that he wouldn't survive the night, but he also expressed hope that the evidence he had collected would eventually bring justice. Maggie closed the journal, her hands shaking. He knew, she whispered. He knew they were going to kill him. Clara placed a hand on her shoulder. And now we know. This is what we needed, Maggie. This is the truth. But as they stood there, the weight of the discovery sinking in, Rufus let out a low growl. Maggie turned, her heart sinking as she saw the headlights approaching in the distance. Clara, she said, her voice trembling. We're not alone. The headlights cut through the early morning mist, their beam bright and unwavering as the car rolled to a stop near the cemetery gates. Maggie's heart pounded in her chest, her fingers tightening around the fragile leather-bound journal. Rufus growled low, his body taut like a spring ready to snap. Clara stepped in front of Maggie instinctively, her hand hovering over her holstered weapon. The car door creaked open, and out stepped Samuel Briggs, his silhouette backlit by the vehicle's lights. He looked more menacing in the pale light, his expression cold and determined. Two other men emerged from the car, both burly, with faces that lacked any warmth or familiarity. They were the kind of men who followed orders without asking questions. "Miss Fenton," Samuel called, his voice steady, but with an edge that sent a chill down Maggie's spine. "We need to have a little chat." "I don't think so," Clara said, her voice sharp as a blade. "You're trespassing on private property, Briggs." Samuel took a slow step forward, his hands raised in mock surrender. "Let's not make this any harder than it needs to be. I just want to know what you found." Maggie swallowed hard, clutching the journal tightly against her chest. "You mean what Thomas Grayson found," she said, her voice quivering but defiant. Samuel's smile was thin and humourless. "Thomas Grayson was a fool. He dug too deep and paid the price. Don't make the same mistake." Clara pulled out her gun, pointing it directly at Samuel. "That sounds like a threat." Samuel stopped, his smile fading. The tension in the air was palpable, the silence stretching like a wire about to snap. One of the men behind Samuel shifted, his hand moving toward his pocket, but Rufus barked sharply, stepping forward with bared teeth. The man froze, his face pale. "You brought a dog to a fight, huh?" Samuel sneered. "That's cute, but it won't save you." Clara took a step forward, her weapon unwavering. "I'm giving you one chance, Briggs. Leave, now." Samuel's eyes narrowed, but after a long moment he raised his hands and stepped back. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low and venomous. "You have no idea what you're up against." The three men retreated to their car, their departure marked by the crunch of gravel under tyres. Maggie let out a shaky breath as the vehicle disappeared down the road. "They're scared," Clara said, lowering her gun. "But not enough to back off." Maggie nodded, her hands trembling as she opened the journal again. "We need to keep moving. If they know we have this, they won't stop until they get it." Clara agreed, and they returned to Maggie's house, where they locked the doors and drew the curtains. Rufus paced the living room, his movements restless, as if he could sense the danger pressing closer. For hours, Maggie and Clara pored over the journal, piecing together the final days of Thomas Grayson's life. Each entry was a revelation, but it was one name in particular that made Maggie's blood run cold: Jonathan Redford. He wasn't just a witness, he was implicated in the corruption, payments to his company, meetings with Crowley. He was deeply entangled in the web of deceit. "We need to confront him," Maggie said, her voice firm. "He knows more than he's letting on." Clara hesitated. "If Redford's involved, he won't talk willingly. We'll need leverage." "We have leverage," Maggie replied, holding up the journal. "This connects him to Crawley and everything else. He'll talk." The next morning, they arrived at Redford's estate, a sprawling property on the outskirts of Briarwood. The house was grand, almost ostentatious, with a long driveway lined by perfectly trimmed hedges. Maggie felt a pang of unease as they approached the front door. Redford answered after the second knock, his expression carefully neutral. "Sheriff Delaney," he said, his tone polite but guarded. "Miss Fenton, to what do I owe this visit?" "We need to talk," Clara said, her voice firm. "Inside." Redford hesitated but stepped aside, gesturing for them to enter. The interior of the house was as grand as the exterior, with polished wood floors and expensive artwork adorning the walls. Redford led them to a sitting room, where he poured himself a glass of scotch before taking a seat. "So," he said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "What's this about?" Maggie placed the journal on the coffee table between them, flipping it open to a page that detailed a meeting between Redford and Crowley. Redford's expression remained neutral, but his fingers tightened around his glass. "You were working with Crowley," Maggie said. "You funded his projects, helped him launder money, and looked the other way when he stole from this town." Redford leaned back, his smile tight. "You're making a lot of accusations, Miss Fenton. Got any proof?" Clara pulled out a photograph from the journal. A picture of Redford and Crowley shaking hands at a construction site. Redford's smile faltered, his confidence wavering. "This is your proof," he scoffed. "A photo of a handshake? That doesn't mean anything." "It's not just the photo," Maggie said. "It's the payments, the meetings, the journal entries. Thomas Grayson was building a case against you, and now we're finishing what he started." Redford's eyes narrowed, his mask of composure slipping. Thomas Grayson was a fool. He thought he could take on people bigger and smarter than him. And look where it got him. Maggie's hands clenched into fists. "You were there the night he disappeared, weren't you?" Redford's jaw tightened, and for a moment Maggie thought he wouldn't answer. But then he leaned forward, his voice low and dangerous. "Yes, I was there, but I didn't kill him." "Then who did?" Clara demanded. Redford hesitated, his gaze shifting to the window. "You don't understand. Crowley wasn't the one in charge. There's someone else, someone more dangerous." "Who?" Maggie pressed. Redford's voice dropped to a whisper. "Arthur Greaves." Maggie exchanged a look with Clara, the name unfamiliar to both of them. "Who is Arthur Greaves?" Maggie asked. "He's the one who bankrolled everything," Redford said. "Crowley, the projects, the whole operation. He's the one who decided Grayson had to go." "Where is he now?" Clara asked. Redford shook his head. "I don't know. He disappeared after Crowley left, but if you're smart, you'll stop digging." Greaves doesn't leave loose ends. Maggie felt a chill run down her spine. We're not stopping, she said, her voice steady. Not until we find out what happened to Thomas. Redford's expression darkened. Then you're signing your own death warrant. Clara stood, her hand resting on her gun. We'll take our chances. But if I find out you're lying, Redford, I'll be back, and I won't be so polite next time. As they left the estate, Maggie's mind raced. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place, but the picture they formed was more terrifying than she had imagined. Arthur Greaves was the key to everything, and finding him was the only way to uncover the full truth. But even as they drove away, Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The shadows seemed deeper, the air heavier, as if the town itself was conspiring to keep its secrets buried. Rufus sat in the back seat, his gaze fixed on the road behind them, his growl barely audible but filled with warning. We're getting closer, Maggie said quietly. I can feel it. Clara nodded, her grip tightening on the steering wheel. Let's just hope we survive long enough to see it through. The air in Briarwood felt heavier the next morning, as if the town itself had absorbed the tension simmering beneath its surface. Maggie sat at her kitchen table, the journal open before her, its pages a grim testament to the sacrifices Thomas Grayson had made in his pursuit of the truth. Rufus lay by her feet, his watchful eyes shifting between her and the window, as if anticipating the next threat. Clara arrived shortly after dawn, her expression guarded but resolute. She placed a steaming cup of coffee in front of Maggie and sat down across from her. I've been asking around about Arthur Greaves, Clara said, her voice low. He's a ghost, no records, no photographs, just a name that keeps coming up in whispers. If he's as dangerous as Redford claims, we need to tread carefully. Maggie nodded, her fingers tracing the edges of the journal. Greaves might be the key to all of this, but we're running out of time. If Redford knows we're closing in, so does Greaves. Clara leaned back in her chair, her brow furrowed. There's something else. Redford called me last night. He said he has more information but wants to meet in person. Do you trust him? Maggie asked, her voice edged with skepticism. No, Clara admitted, but we don't have a choice. If he's willing to talk, we need to hear what he has to say. The meeting was set for later that evening at an abandoned factory on the outskirts of town. Maggie spent the day organising the evidence they'd gathered, her thoughts a whirlwind of anxiety and determination. Rufus followed her closely, his presence a silent reminder of the stakes. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across Briarwood, Maggie was ready. The factory was a relic of Briarwood's industrial past, its rusted walls and shattered windows a stark contrast to the polished facade of the town centre. Clara parked her car a safe distance away, her hand resting on her gun as they approached the entrance. Rufus trotted ahead, his nose to the ground, his movements deliberate and cautious. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint scent of mildew. Redford stood near the centre of the room, his posture tense, his face illuminated by the faint glow of a flashlight he'd propped against a wall. He looked different. Less polished, more desperate. You came, he said, his voice carrying a mix of relief and trepidation. We're here, Clara replied, her tone firm. Now talk. Redford glanced around nervously before pulling a folded piece of paper from his jacket. This is everything I know about Greaves. Names, locations, connections. But I need something in return. What could you possibly want? Maggie asked, her voice sharp. You've already admitted your part in this. I want protection, Redford said, his gaze darting toward the shadows. You don't understand who you're dealing with. Greaves doesn't leave loose ends. If he finds out I talk to you, he won't have the chance, Clara interrupted. But if you're lying, Redford, I'll make sure you regret it. Redford nodded, his hands trembling as he handed the paper to Clara. Maggie leaned in to look, her eyes scanning the list of names. Most were unfamiliar, but one stood out. Edward Monroe. The caretaker, Maggie whispered, her voice laced with disbelief. Redford hesitated before answering. Monroe was more than just a caretaker. He worked for Greaves, keeping an eye on the cemetery and making sure no one got too curious about that grave. Maggie's stomach churned. She thought of Edward's cryptic remarks, his reluctance to discuss the grave. He knew, she said softly. He knew about Thomas. Redford nodded. He didn't want to get involved, but Greaves doesn't give people a choice. Monroe was just a pawn. Clara stepped forward, her expression dark. Where's Greaves now? Redford shook his head. I don't know, but if you find Monroe, he might. Before anyone could respond, Rufus let out a low, menacing growl. Maggie turned just in time to see a shadow move near the entrance. Clara reacted instantly, drawing her gun and stepping in front of Maggie. Who's there? Clara demanded, her voice echoing through the cavernous space. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of footsteps retreating into the night. Clara and Rufus moved quickly, checking the perimeter, but whoever had been watching was already gone. We need to leave, Clara said, her tone urgent. Now! They returned to Maggie's house, the weight of Redford's revelation pressing down on them. Maggie couldn't stop thinking about Edward, his quiet demeanour, his evasive answers. Had he been complicit in Thomas's death, or was he just another victim of Greaves's manipulation? The next morning, Maggie and Clara confronted Edward at the cemetery. He was trimming the hedges near the entrance, his movements deliberate but slow, as if weighed down by an invisible burden. He looked up as they approached, his expression unreadable. Morning, Edward said, his voice calm. What brings you here so early? We need to talk, Clara said, her tone leaving no room for argument. About Thomas Grayson. Edward's hands stilled, the clippers falling to his side. I was wondering when you'd ask, he said quietly. Maggie stepped forward, her heart pounding. You knew him, didn't you? You knew what happened to him. Edward sighed, his shoulders slumping. I didn't have a choice, he said. Greaves came to me years ago. He said he needed someone to keep an eye on things here, to make sure no one started asking questions. I didn't know what I was getting into. But you knew about the grave, Maggie pressed. You knew it was Thomas. Edward nodded, his eyes filled with regret. I tried to stay out of it. But when Greaves had him killed, they buried him here, told me to keep quiet. I couldn't stop it, but I couldn't leave either. I've been stuck ever since. Maggie's chest tightened with anger and sorrow. Why didn't you come forward? Because Greaves would have killed me, Edward said, his voice trembling. He doesn't forgive. He doesn't forget. Clara stepped closer, her gaze piercing. Where is he now? Edward hesitated, glancing toward the grave Rufus had been guarding so fiercely. There's a cabin in the woods, about 10 miles from here. It's where Greaves goes when he doesn't want to be found. But if you're thinking about going after him, we are, Clara said firmly. And you're coming with us. Edward looked at her, his face pale but resigned. All right, he said. But if we're doing this, you need to know, Greaves isn't just going to let you walk away. Maggie exchanged a look with Clara, her resolve hardening. We're not walking away, she said. Not until we finish what Thomas started. As they left the cemetery, Rufus trotted beside them, his steps steady, his gaze forward. The path ahead was fraught with danger, but the truth was within reach, and Maggie was determined to see it through, no matter the cost. The drive to the cabin was heavy with silence, broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of the trees as the wind picked up. Maggie sat in the back seat, clutching the journal as if it were a lifeline. Edward sat beside her, his face pale and drawn, his hands fidgeting nervously in his lap. Clara drove, her gaze focused and her jaw set, the weight of the mission pressing heavily on her shoulders. Rufus sat upright, his ears alert, his presence a steadying force amidst the tension. As they neared the cabin, the trees thickened, their shadows lengthening in the dim light of early evening. The road was little more than a dirt trail, overgrown and barely visible in places. Edward pointed to a break in the trees, his voice trembling. It's just up ahead. Clara slowed the car, pulling it off the road and into the cover of the trees. She turned to Edward. You stay here. If things go south, you're our witness. Edward nodded, relief flickering briefly across his face. Maggie glanced at Rufus. who was already poised at the door, ready to spring into action. She reached out, resting a hand on his back. "Stay close, boy," she whispered. The cabin came into view as they approached on foot. It was small and unassuming, its weathered wood blending into the forest around it. A single light burned in the window, casting a faint glow onto the porch. Clara motioned for Maggie to stay behind her as they crept closer, her weapon drawn. Rufus moved silently, his steps deliberate as he sniffed the air. When they reached the porch, he froze, his body tense, his ears pinned back. Maggie felt her heart skip a beat. "He knows someone's inside," she murmured. Clara nodded, her grip tightening on her gun. She stepped onto the porch, the wood creaking beneath her weight. "Arthur Greaves," she called, her voice firm. "This is Sheriff Delaney. We need to talk." There was no response. The silence was deafening, the kind that makes every small sound feel magnified. Clara stepped to the door, knocking sharply. "Arthur, we know you're in there." The sound of movement inside was faint but unmistakable. Clara glanced at Maggie, then back at the door. She tried the handle. It was unlocked. Pushing it open slowly, she stepped inside, her gun raised. The cabin was sparsely furnished, its interior dimly lit by a single lamp. Papers were scattered across a table in the center of the room, along with an open laptop. A man stood at the far end, his back to them, his hands raised in surrender. "I figured you'd find me eventually," he said, his voice calm, almost amused. He turned slowly, revealing a gaunt face with sharp features and piercing blue eyes. "Arthur Greaves," he said, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. "At your service." Clara stepped forward, her gun trained on him. "Sit," she commanded, gesturing to the chair by the table. Greaves complied, his movements slow and deliberate. He folded his hands on the table, his eyes darting to Maggie and Rufus as they entered. "Ah, the journalist and her loyal companion," he said. "You've caused quite the stir, Miss Fenton." Maggie ignored the comment, stepping closer to the table. "You had Thomas Grayson killed," she said, her voice steady despite the anger boiling inside her. "You buried him in an unmarked grave and thought you could bury the truth with him." Greaves's smirk widened. "Thomas was a talented man, but he didn't know when to stop. He dug too deep, and well, you know how that ends." "Not this time," Clara said, her voice cold. "We have enough evidence to bring you down, Greaves. The journal, the documents, everything. It's over." Greaves leaned back in his chair, his smirk fading. "Evidence is only as powerful as the people willing to use it. Do you think anyone in this town has the spine to take me down? They've all benefited from my work, one way or another." Maggie stepped forward, slamming the journal onto the table. "You don't get to hide behind fear anymore. This town deserves the truth, and Thomas deserves justice." Rufus growled low, his gaze locked on Greaves. The man glanced at the dog, a flicker of unease crossing his face. "That dog," he said slowly. "He was with Thomas the night he died, wasn't he?" "Yes," Maggie said, her voice unwavering. "And he's been guarding Thomas's grave ever since, waiting for this moment." Greaves let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Loyalty like that is rare. Pity it won't matter." Before anyone could react, Greaves lunged for the laptop on the table. Clara moved quickly, grabbing his arm and forcing him back into the chair. The laptop slid to the floor, its screen going dark. "Nice try," Clara said, her voice sharp. "But it's over." Rufus barked sharply, his body tense as he moved to Maggie's side. Clara cuffed Greaves, her movements efficient and precise. "You're coming with us," she said, pulling him to his feet. Greaves didn't resist, his smirk returning as they led him outside. "You think this is justice?" he said, his tone mocking. "This town will never change. People like me are necessary. Without us, Briarwood would crumble." Maggie stopped, turning to face him. "Briarwood will heal," she said, "because people like Thomas and Rufus made sure of it." They loaded Greaves into Clara's car, the weight of their victory sinking in as they drove back to town. The evidence they'd gathered, combined with Greaves's arrest, would be enough to bring the entire operation to light. For the first time in years, the truth felt within reach. Back in Briarwood, news of Greaves's arrest spread quickly. The town was divided, with some celebrating the end of an era of corruption and others fearing the repercussions of the truth. Maggie knew it would take time for the wounds to heal, but she also knew that justice had been served. At Thomas's grave, Maggie knelt beside Rufus, her hand resting gently on his head. "We did it," she whispered. "Thomas can rest now." Rufus wagged his tail softly, his gaze steady as he lay down beside the grave. Maggie felt a sense of peace wash over her, the weight of the past finally lifting. She looked toward the horizon, the first rays of dawn breaking through the trees. For the first time in years, Briarwood felt hopeful, and for Maggie, Clara, and Rufus, the journey had been worth every step. Together they had uncovered the truth, brought justice to the man who had fought for it, and ensured that his story would never be forgotten.